to start from here, and as we have been doing, we're going to dedicate our learning to the hostages, and hopefully that they should come home soon, and the soldiers, and to Am Yisrael, and to all the innocents in the battles. So we're up to a new part of the sugya about children, as it happens. So we have a braita. It says, Tanu Rabbanan, Tinokot mutarim bekulan, chutz minilata sandal. Tinokot are permitted with all of them, except for nilata sandal, except for wearing shoes. So, what does that mean? What does it mean, mutarim bekulan?
All the Inuim.
They can eat.
Yes, right. So it means, like Michael said, so it's all of the Inuyim. This braita, the braita presumably is an addendum to our Mishnah at the beginning of the parak, which details the Inuyim. And then apparently we have a braita that says that children are permitted with all of them, except for putting on shoes. So the Gemara wants to know, Ma'ishna nilata sandal. What's the difference about wearing a shoe? So what's their question?
Why is a shoe forbidden for the Tinuk and the other Inuim are permitted?
So, right. So it says that Tinok is permitted in all of them except for Nilata Sandal. So the Gemara wants to know, so what's different about Nilata Sandal that Nilata Sandal should be forbidden for the Tinok? They could have asked also the other way around. Why are the other things permitted? But what's our assumption going in? Why should Tinokot be exempt from Inuyim?
Is it obvious that the Tinok is a boy under 13 and a girl under 12, or somebody?
Yes. So first of all, that's a good point. So Tinokot here would the obvious, or I'd say the assumption is going to be that we're talking about children who are under the age of mitzvah, right? So for a boy, that's 13 in a day, and for a girl, it's 12 in a day. So, and we'll get back to that a little bit later, but the wording of the braita is worth examination. And first of all, right, so what's a tinok? So let's say the tinok is as we defined it. And it says, it uses this term mutarim bekulan. They're permitted with all of them. As the braita could have used a different lashon. It could have said tinokot turin mikulan, that they're exempt from all of them. So what's the difference between saying patur and mutar?
Patur would imply that at one point there might have been a chiyuv, and mutar maybe implies that it's just allowed. It's not connected to the isur.
Okay, so let's say yes. Let's tighten that up a little. So we use the term patur. Here, let's take a second and
There's something like an exception. Mutar, the din doesn't even apply.
right.
I think so. I'm not sure.
No. But that's so yes. So this So that's correct. That when we say patur, so we've mentioned this elsewhere. So let's say in the context of Mishnah Shabbat, if a Mishnah says patur, the understanding is in most cases patur of al asur. You're exempt, meaning you're exempt from punishment. Patur is a term we use in regards to punishment, right? Either you're chayav a punishment or you're patur from punishment. So if you're exempt from punishment, it means that the isur exists, but you don't get punished if you violate the isur. You're exempt from punishment for whatever reason. But let's say early on in our sugya, we talked about the question of chatzi shiur, and we understood that chatzi shiur is asur min Torah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and that's the conclusion of the sugya. But that if somebody eats chatzi shiur on Yom Kippur, they're patur from punishment, at least from a Torah punishment, right? They're exempt from punishment. Doesn't mean you're allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. It would actually imply the opposite, like Michael is implying, that there is an isur, you're not allowed to eat, but if you do eat less than a shiur, you're exempt from punishment. That if I say, tinokot mutarim bekulan, the children are permitted with all of them, it means there's no isur. They're allowed to eat under any circumstance. So, wait a second, let's go back. Okay. So Maishna Nilata Sandal. So what's different about Nilata Sandal? So now, according to the Braita, what's the din of Nilata Sandal for Tinokot? If you were, yeah, go ahead.
It's permissible. It's completely permissible. There's no obligation.
For Nilata Sandal.
Chayavim.
Well, so not chayavim. So,
I'm sorry. I'm off. I'm sorry. I'm opposite.
Okay. Right, that's okay. Tinokot mutarim bekulan chutz min nilata sandal. So what would be the din for nilata sandal? Would they be chayav? If they're not mutar, then what's their din?
It's not clear that they could be patur. No.
Well, just in the context of the Braita, what would I say? If they're not mutarin, then what would be their din?
Then they're asur.
It's asurin. So let's keep that in mind. So tinokot are permitted with all the inuyim, meaning implying, right, that the inuyim don't apply to them, that they can do any of the inuyim except for nilata sandal, implying that that's asur. That's asur for them, but it still doesn't say that they're chayavim. That there isn't a chiyuv if they're over and wear shoes, but they're not allowed to wear shoes. So now, with this in mind, the Gemara asks the question, Maishna Nilata Sandal. So what's different about Nilata Sandal? What's different about Nilata Sandal that in contrast to the other Inuyim? All the other Inuyim, they're mutarim, and Nilata Sandal, they're asurim. So Gemara answers, the Amri, Inshi Avdule. Because they'll say people did it for them. So who will say this, and who are these people? What does it mean, Inchi Avdule? The people did it for them. I should say, people did it for them. That's the literal translation. So what does that mean, people did it for them?
People put on their shoes, they're babies, they can't do it themselves.
So, okay. So actually you said a lot. So that people will say that people put shoes on for them. So what would be the prompt? And the Amri, people will, the Amri means people, just they will say, meaning people in general will look and they'll see, if they see your kid wearing shoes, then they'll say other people must have put their shoes on, maybe like Michael says, because we don't assume that very young children, right? Maybe a child who's close to bar bat mitzvah, but we're including all children under the age of mitzvah, and we'll say that people put on shoes for them. So what would be the problem with that? Why is that problematic?
Because I don't know, I think the grown-ups shouldn't wear shoes, and so they do not, the same way they don't put shoes on their feet, they shouldn't put shoes on the feet of their children, because they are doing it.
Okay, so it's going to be something along those lines. That is, the implication of this answer is that people are going to see that children have shoes on, and then they will have to come to the conclusion that an adult put the child's shoes on, and that would be forbidden. And the implication is that an adult is not allowed to be over on one of the inuyim for their child, or for a child, even for somebody who's not chayav b'mitzvot, they're not allowed to do it. So at this moment, then we'll think. So let's say that's the case. In other words, let's say the implication is adults are not allowed to. They're not allowed to be over on inuyim for their child. So at that moment, I'm thinking, okay, so it means the child.
They are allowed to wash them to do.
So actually, we talked about
they
that.
They also do it because they're washing the child. The same. It's very close to putting shoes on their feet.
Okay, so actually, that's what the Gemara is going to say now in a moment. But before we get to that, no, that's the thing. We're going to say, okay, so maybe it's like Michael said, maybe putting on shoes is something that not all children can do, but then you could say, okay, but we just said they're allowed to do all of the other things, including, let's say, take something simple like eating. But we also know that infants don't feed themselves either.
You have to feed them. Yes.
You still have to feed them. And what about washing or sicha, right? So this is what Gemara says, Hanachnami Amri. So these also, they will say, in Avdule. But regard Hanach here, these is going to refer back to the other 4 Inuyim. What about these other Inuyim? If they do them, or it's if people see children who are washed, or people, children who have been anointed with oil, then people are also going to say, older people, right? Adults must have done that for them. So the Gemara answers, says, okay, rechitza v'sicha. So if you're worried about washing or anointing the child, that is people are going to see the child, and they'll see that the child is washed, or they'll see that the child has oil on them, then Amor Me'etmol Avdile. Then people will look and they can say that, oh, they must have done that yesterday. The adults would have done that the day before. But what about shoes? The assumption is that that answer assumes that what? That shoes is something that they would have only put on today. So the Gemara asks that. What about a sandal? People will.
If you're not on Toranot in the army.
What's that? What's that?
You assume that they are not Toranot in the army or something.
So they'll say sandal nami. They'll look at the child who has the shoes, and they'll see that he has shoes. And they could also say that, okay, an adult put their shoes on yesterday. Why should I assume that the adult put the shoes on today? In other words, if I'm going to give benefit of the doubt to the adults regarding washing or anointing, I should also give the same benefit of the doubt to having put on shoes from yesterday. So here the Gemara gives an interesting answer. And Gemara says, Sandal lo efshar demeitmol avdile. Regarding a sandal, it's not possible that they put the shoes on yesterday. Why? The Amar Shmuel, Haiman debay lemitam ta'ama demituta lisim asana velikni. Shmuel said, this man, this person who wants to taste the taste of death, he should put on his shoes and go to sleep. So Shmuel was voicing what apparently was, I don't think it was Dat Yachid in this regard, but he voices this opinion, which maybe was like a widespread belief or widespread acceptance, that somebody who wants to taste the taste of death should sleep in their shoes. That is, this is something that you don't do. Nobody would put their shoes on and go to sleep. And so similarly, when it comes to the children, what will we say if we see that they have shoes on today?
That they slept in them last night.
Or lehefech, that they must not have slept in them last night, right?
Yes, they wouldn't make them wear them overnight. Okay.
Right. They wouldn't have, no adult would have put shoes on their children and let them go to sleep, because this is like tasting the taste of death, to wear your shoes when you sleep. So that's not something that parents would do for their children. Okay, so
what about feeding animals?
Let's leave the what about questions for now. Let's just get through this.
But you have to do it.
I understand, but
you know it's a problem now in the OTEF. You have
You're right, but that's not what the Gemara is talking about. Let's stick for the moment to just what the Gemara is talking about. So the Gemara is talking about this idea. So what do we have so far? We have children. We say children are permitted in all of the Inuyim except for Neilata Sandal. So we want to know why is it they're permitted for why is it they're permitted for all the other Inuyim except for Neilata Sandal? And so the first answer is, we say, because people will look at them with their shoes on, people will see the children with their shoes on, and they'll say, an adult must have put those shoes on for them. And the implication of that problem is that that the adult would not be allowed themselves to be over on Inuyim for their child. right? They can't do something to directly have their child violate one of the inuyim. So the Gemara says, but I could say the same thing about rechitza v'sicha. So of all the inuyim, why did they pick rechitza v'sicha as being a problem? In other words, so what's the thing with rechitza v'sicha? So we say, if you say that I see the child with shoes, and that implies that they're, that an adult, their parents, let's say, put their shoes on for them, then why should they be permitted? Why should children be permitted with rechitza v'sicha? Right? So we answer with rechitza v'sicha. We'll say that they washed them or anointed them the day before. What about the other inuyim? So what other inuyim are we not talking about here? We have rechitza sicha, nilata sandal. What are the other inuyim?
Eating and drinking and marital relations.
Eating, drinking, marital relations. So we have, right? Second. Right, so these are the inuyim. Sicha, rechitza sicha, nilata sandal, tashmish mita, and of course achila v'sicha. So here we're saying children are mutar with all of them. So now, which of the other ones are we not really worried about? We'd say tashmish mita is, even though in principle they're mutar, but based on what we just learned. But when we're talking about children, we're going to assume that this is not really an issue. Also, it's not something that people would likely see. But when it comes to the other ones, we're still left with rechitza and sicha, and achila and shtiyah. So when the Gemara here picks on achila v'shtiyah, excuse me, the Gemara here picks on rechitza v'sicha as examples of other ones. So we can say why, because why do we use rechitza v'sicha as in the question? Because if it would be eating and drinking, what would we see if a child is eating and drinking? So it could be eating and drinking are not like rechitza v'sicha in this context, because you don't necessarily see the child eating and drinking, and if you do, it could be that you just see a child eating and drinking by themselves. In other words, it's not perforce that you necessarily have to be fed, but if Gemara, in theory, could have asked the same thing about achila v'shtiyah as it does about rechitza v'sicha. But what's the thing with rechitza v'sicha? Let's say it's a state. It's not something that happens in a moment. Let's say when you're eating or drinking at a certain moment. But the way the Gemara is understanding rechitza v'sicha here is that we can observe the child who's washed or anointed in the same way that we can observe the child who has shoes on, right? So it's not that we saw somebody go and put shoes on the child. We see a child who has shoes on. In a similar way, I can look and see if a child has been washed. And remember, I think part of the implication here is a cultural implication that we don't think about so much anymore. People didn't necessarily wash every day the way we wash, right? They didn't have indoor plumbing. They weren't taking showers and baths every day. So you could see if a child has been cleaned. And if they had oil on them, you would see that there's oil on them, right? Because it'll be a little shiny or whatever the indications are. But if you see a child walking around stum, you don't know if they've been fed. You can't necessarily observe them having been fed, but you can observe if they're clean. or if they've been anointed with oil. So the Gemara says, "Rechitza b'sicha." What you're right? With Rechitza b'sicha, I could say that was done yesterday. So that's what's different about Rechitza b'sicha as opposed to Nilata Sandal. Rechitza b'sicha, if I see a child who's clean, people observing are going to say, "Oh, they must have been washed yesterday." In other words, we'll give their parents, let's say, the benefit of the doubt. Nobody washed them today, but somebody washed them yesterday. Masha'en ken with Nilata Sandal, I can see them wearing sandalim right now. So I can't say that. So then the Gemara says, why don't I say that they put the shoes on yesterday? So then we have the answer based on Shmuel's statement that nobody would put shoes on their child and let them sleep overnight. Okay, so what do we have so far? We haven't talked directly about Achila v'Shtiyah, but we did see that earlier in the Gemara. We'll talk about that in a second, right? We had a sukkah earlier about eating and drinking and feeding, but here, this is what we have. So we have that Rechitza b'sicha mutarin. So what's the implication of mutarin? The child is permitted to be washed. It's not just that the child is permitted to wash and to put on oil. The child is permitted to be washed passively and to have oil put on them passively. But they're not permitted to have their shoes put on, even passively. The Gemara says on that, Vahat mutarin lichatchila katani. But the Braita uses this term mutarin. So mutar, this is why we discussed this a little bit already. Mutar implies that even lechatchila, they're allowed to do all of these things. So what does the mutar mean now in context? So like we said, mutar for the tinokot to be mutarin implies two possible scenarios. One is that the child is doing it; they're allowed to wash and to do sikha and to eat and drink, but they wouldn't be allowed to put on shoes. The other scenario is that it's permitted to feed them both food and drink, and it would be permitted for somebody to wash them or do sikha for them, but it would not be permitted for somebody to put shoes on them, right? So one is active, that the child would do it, and the other is passive, that somebody does it for or to the child. So what's the Gemara's question? The ha-mutarin l'chatchila katani. Mutarin implies that l'chatchila, it's permitted. So what's the implication of that? For whom is it mutar l'chatchila? These other things, particularly now, let's say rechitza b'sicha. For whom is it permitted to do rechitza b'sicha? I apologize. I'm trying not to confuse you, but I have this sense that I'm confusing you. When the Braita says that tinokot mutarin bekulan, for whom is it mutar to do these inuyim?
It's really specifying just for the tinokot.
So from the Braita itself, I might say it just means that the tinok can do it. But now, the way the Gemara has discussed it, we just brought up this question about rechitza b'sicha. And so, what's the thing? Why did the Gemara say that that rechitza b'sicha is okay?
Because it could have been done the day before, which implies that on Yom Kippur it would be forbidden.
Right. Exactly. So if I say that the reason Rechitza B'Sicha is going to be permitted is because people looking at the child will assume that it was done the day before, then what am I talking about? I'm talking about the other side of mutar, which is that it's mutar for adults to do it for them. And if I were to think that they were washed today, that would be asur. The only reason, according to the Gemara Adkan, the only reason Rechitza V'Sicha is mutar for the child is because we'll assume that A, it was done by adult, but B, that it was done the day before. And Masha'en Kain, about Nilata Sandal, which I know because of Shmuel, I know that would have only been done today, and that's why it's asur. It's asur because people seeing the child with shoes on are going to assume that an adult put their shoes on today. So on this the Gemara says V'ha mutarin l'chatchila katani. Whatever is permitted, it says mutar, meaning l'chatchila, that under any chatchila, Rashi's going to explain this better. We'll look at Rashi in a second. But we've talked about this before. What does l'chatchila mean? L'chatchila really means that before you do something that may involve, that some halachic act, if you come to get advice from an expert in halacha, if it's mutar l'chatchila, it means that even from the outset, that someone will tell you that this is how you may do it. Right? And b'diavad is when you come after the fact, after you've already done it, to find out if you either did a mitzvah or you were over on a halacha or something like that. You're asking de facto. So the way the Gemara has built up its argument is by saying, okay, the reason Nilata Sandal is asur is because people will look at the child and they'll assume that the shoes were put on by an adult today, and that we'll assume that that's asur, that it can't be seen that an adult would have done something to them today. But if I look at the child and I see that they're clean, I can say they did it yesterday. But why should it be an issue? Why should I have to assume that they did it yesterday? It's mutar l'chatchila according to the Braita. If it's mutar l'chatchila, that means they could do it today. And if they can do it today, then hadran kushin leduchta. I want to know what's different about nilata sandal than, let's say, rechitza b'sicha. Does that make sense? Okay. Ella. Okay, so basically, the Gemara has to push away this whole line of reasoning. I'm going to give a different line of reasoning. It gives also a very interesting line of reasoning. The Gemara says, Hanach delav Rabbi Tihu gazru bahen Rabbanan. Hanach de Rabbi Tihu lo gazru bahu Rabbanan. So what does that mean? So it literally means Hanach delav Rabbi Tihu, these things that don't help them grow. These things that are not part of, helping them grow properly, the Rabbanan made a gzeira. But these things that do help them grow properly, they didn't make a gzeira. In other words, it's a completely different approach. So what does it mean to help them grow or to not help them grow? So the Gemara brings an example. One second. Paul, are you still with us? Oh, well, okay. So Damar Abaye, Amali Aim, my mother told me, Ridite Dianuka, the upbringing of a child, Maya Chamimi Umashcha. You need hot, she says, hot water and oil. In other words, when you're raising a child, when they're in the implication you'll see is that when they're very little, you have to give them hot water and oil. That is, you have to wash them with hot water and you have to anoint them with oil. Gadal purta, when they get a little older, they grow a little. Biata bekutacha. You give them an egg in kutach. Kutach was this, some kind of a tavshil that people used to eat, and she said you give them kutach with egg. Gadal purta, they grow a little older. Tavure mane, they break kelim, they break vessels. What does that mean? Kihada Rabba, like this. This is what we know about Rabba. Zavin luhumani gzizi de pachra livnei. He would buy broken, or let's say, it's another word I'm looking for. Let's say cracked. That's how Rashi says. Cracked vessels made of clay. In other words, he would buy cracked pottery for his son, and he would break them. Okay, so what does all this mean? Okay, so before we go through and understand Abaye, what we're going to understand from the Gemara is that there's certain things that are, we'll put it this way, the Gemara is answering by saying there's certain things that are necessary for the proper growth of a child. So those things that are necessary for the proper growth of a child, the Chachamim weren't gozer for the child on Yom Kippur, meaning not only are they permitted to do it, but even adults are permitted to do for them. So, and then we'll see, one of the things we'll get from Abaye's mother is that children who are growing up need to be washed and oiled. So Chachamim weren't gozer on rechitza b'sicha for children because it's a necessary part of their upbringing. And in the context of our sugya, then we'll understand that the rechitza b'sicha that they had to do, maybe that's something you have to do every day, right? So let's say adults didn't necessarily have to wash and put on oil every day, but that the child should grow properly, you have to wash and anoint them with oil every day. Nilata sandal is not one of the things that they absolutely have to grow properly. So you can let them go barefoot for at least a day. So that's what we get out of this. So at the end here, so what's our conclusion? The halacha. What are children allowed to do, and what are we allowed to do for children on Yom Kippur?
So both the children and we are allowed to do for the children the things that they need to grow properly. So eating, drinking, and washing and anointing.
Effect. And that which they don't need, like nilata sandal, then they're not allowed to put on shoes, and we're not allowed to put shoes on for them. So that's the difference. So the implication here then is that nilata sandal, or let's say the implication, let's say we could say a wider thing, that really Chachamim would have been gozer on children to not be allowed any of the inuyim. But they allowed the inuyim that they need for their proper growth. But otherwise, they would be gozer, and so the one area where they were gozer was nilata sandal. Why would Chachamim want to be gozer altogether about children and inuyim? Why should they make the gzera? Min haTorah, they're not chayav b'mitzvot, so why are they making the gzera at all?
maybe if there's a fear that if you're preparing food for the children, you may eat yourself.
Okay. That's definitely possible. Let's say something. What about the children themselves? That is, it's a general question. What a child isn't chayav mitzvot until they reach age, right? Until they reach gil mitzvot. So why should we be concerned about whether they're over on mitzvot or mekayem mitzvot until then?
There, chinuch. I hear often chinuch to get the kids used to doing the mitzvot properly.
Yeah. So we have a concept. There's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan that you have to be mechanech your child b'mitzvot. So you start to teach them mitzvot from the time they're very, very young. And elsewhere in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, and the Tosefta, it talks about different things. Like when a child is able to speak, you teach them to say Shema Yisrael. So they're not chayav to say Shema until they're going to be of age. But you do chinuch from the time they're very young. Right? Look at the very first. Maybe we'll take a moment and look. You look at the very beginning of Masechet Chagiga. This is where one of the sources where we start to talk about this. So when we have the braita of Tinokot Mutarin Bekulan Chutz Minilata Sandal, actually it's a big chidush. Because yes, on the one hand, of course, they're pturim from chiyuv, but why don't I say that I'm gozer mishum chinuch? I should say that mishum chinuch, I don't want them to have any exposure to the inu, like there shouldn't be allowed any inuyim. Rather, they should start to suffer. Okay, so with so the braita comes from the other side. It says actually they're mutar in all of them. So that's the tmiyah. The truth is, this is really what gets us to start thinking. What gets the Gemara? It's behind, I think, what the Gemara is thinking. So the Gemara starts off by saying, okay, but why do you permit everything and not nilata sandal? But in the end, I need to come up with a larger theory, because to begin with, I could argue, to begin with, I should have said they're asur b'kulan. And I could have started from the other side. I could have said, Tinokot asurin b'niyata sandal, mutarin b'achila rechitza, achila shtiya rechitza b'sicha. But I start off with the idea that actually they're mutar b'kulan. So the mutar b'kulan, so that's why the Gemara has to come up ultimately with a basis, conceptual basis, which is that here I don't apply chinuch when it might be detrimental to the child. And the implication here is that it might be detrimental physically to the child if you don't, let's say, do rechitza v'sicha for them every day. So you have to do rechitza v'sicha for them every day. Let's look at Rashi. By the way, I didn't bother to bring you other examples, but Abaye in almost 36 places I did check. He quotes his mother in a lot of contexts. It's a very interesting thing. Maybe, and you're shaking hand, maybe you've seen other ones.
I've seen it in several places recently.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the mother is not giving us, is not ostensibly giving us a halachic statement, but Abaye took it and incorporated into a halachic framework. The mother is saying, presumably the mother is saying what she knows, because this is what you do. She's a mother; she knows how to raise children. And Abaye took that to heart, right? This is a serious thing. My mother said, so my mother said it. The implication is my mother knows what she's doing, probably not just because she's a mother, she happens to be a mother, but she has her own tradition. And the mother's tradition is no less important. I have to take what my mother says seriously. And so, based on the way he learned from his mother, the way you raise a child, then he was able to understand how Chazal themselves constructed this halacha of inuyim and children on Yom Kippur. And this is what makes sense. Now, on Yom Kippur, we're going to do for them the things that they need. And on that, it's not just that it's okay, it's mutar chatchila. This is what you should be doing. It's a very interesting interweaving of halacha and what we might call folk wisdom. I don't want to say that in a condescending way. I think that wisdom, like I say, it was taken very seriously, and like you see in other places, Amrali Ein, my mother told me, has halachic weight. It's something was taken very seriously. Women knew things that men didn't know. Okay. So Rashi says, Tanu Rabbanan, Tinokot mutorim bekulan. What does it mean, mutorim bekulan? B'chol hane dematnitin, achila ushtiya u'chitza v'sicha. Right, so he leaves out tashmish hamita, like we said, presumably for obvious reasons. But the other ones are, let's say, more self-evident. So children are mutar for all of these things: eating, drinking, washing, and anointing. Right? Chutz mi nilata hasandal, ma'ishna nilata sandal. The amri inshi avdule. People will say that people did it for them. Rashi explains, inshi avdule, gedolim asula. Adults did it for him. Torah hizhira gedolim al aktanim, shelo yasu lehem biyadam davar asur. Kedamrinan b'masechet Yevamot, lo tochlum, lo ta'achilum, lahazhir gedolim al aktanim. So the Torah, second. The Torah people will say that other people did it for him. And what we'll say is that adults did it for the child, and the Torah warned adults from doing for children anything that's asur. They're not allowed to be a dime, they're not allowed to directly do something asur for them. Like we learn Masechet Yevamot, lo tochlum, lo ta'achilum. Don't eat, right? The pasuk says, don't eat them. And the drash is lo ta'achilum. Don't feed to them. La'azhir gedolim al ktanim. This is to give an azhara, a warning to gedolim to adults regarding children. I think that we looked at this one other time. Let's just take a quick look at what Rashi is talking about. This is Gemara in Yevamot, Kuf Yud Daled Amud Aleph. And there's a brighter here, Tashma lo tochlum, kisheketsen. So what's the pasuk? This is talking about the shkatzim, right? The crawly things, the vermin that the Torah says one isn't allowed to eat, right? The chol hasheretz hashoretz haaretz sheketzu lo yeachel. And kol holech al gachon, anything that goes on its throat, kol holech al arba, anything that goes on four, ad kol marbe raglayim, up to shekets that has many legs. L'chol hasheretz hashoretz haaretz, for any kind of crawly thing that crawls on the ground. Lo tochlum, do not eat them, ki sheketzin, because they are shekets. So the Yisur, the Stam Yisur here is you're not allowed to eat shkatzim. But the Braita here says, lo tochlum ki sheketzim, lo ta'achilum, right? So the drasha is, let's not read it lo tochlum, that you shouldn't eat them, but rather lo ta'achilum, do not feed them. This is to warn adults regarding children. That what? That they're not allowed to feed. They're not allowed to feed shkatzim to children. Rashi explains a little bit. Lo tochlim ki shekatzim krayu teirahu dahaktive azharot harbe bishratzim. We didn't really. Why did they choose to darshan this pasuk of lo tochlim? Because the truth is, it's a repetition of something that we learn in Parshat Shkatzim. We have a lot of azharot about not eating them. So here the idea is that you're not allowed to feed shkatzim to children. It's enough for us. This is part of a longer sugya that has to do with this question of adults keeping, not allowing children to be over on Yisurim. Okay, so back to Rashi. Maishna nilata sandal. So what's different about nilata sandal? Because people will say, inshi avdile. People will say that people did it for him. In other words, people will see the child with the shoes, and then they'll say, oh, some adult put their shoes on for them. So what's the problem with that? It's this problem of lo ta'achilum that we learn out that adults are not allowed to do isurim for their children. They're not allowed to be adayim in some direct fashion, have them over on an isur. And why not? So here you could say it's gzerat katuv, but of course it fits into the idea of chinuch. And maybe this is this is one of the ways that we learn out that chinuch has this power. Okay, so that's what the Gemara wants to say. It says, why is nilata sandal not permitted, and all the other isurim are permitted for the child? The inuyim are permitted for the child on Yom Kippur, because people will see the child wearing shoes, and they'll say that somebody put on their shoes, and then that will cause them to be choshed, right, to suspect that an adult was over, had transgressed by doing an isur for their child. So then the Gemara says, okay, hanachnami amri, but the other ones, let's say rechitza b'sicha, people can also look at the child and see the child is clean, and they'll say inshi avdile. Then they'll also suspect him of having washed the child on Yom Kippur, and having done an isur biyadayim on the child. So the Gemara answers, "V'chitza v'sicha emor me'etmol avdile." No, say no. If people see a clean child on Yom Kippur, they won't necessarily jump to the conclusion that they were washed today. You might say, okay, that they probably did yesterday. Sadal nami. So same thing. Why don't we say they'll look at the child, they're wearing sandalim, we'll say they put the sandalim on yesterday. So then we give the answer, sandal lo efshar de me'atmol avdilei. Right? And Rashi says, what does it mean, lo efshar me'atmol? V'hei yashen kol halayla v'heim b'rakla. It can't be that the adult put shoes on the child and that the child slept with shoes on all night. Because Shmuel says that to rephrase Shmuel, putting on shoes and sleeping with them all night is tasting the taste of death, which is clearly something we don't want to do. So we wouldn't suspect a parent of having put their child's shoes on and letting them sleep on, let's say, before Yom Kippur, and then letting them sleep on the night of Yom Kippur, just so that they can have shoes on the next day, because they wouldn't want their child to taste the taste of death. So where does that leave us? It leaves it, so presumably now we've answered the question of what's different about Nilata Sandal. So what did we say? The other Inuyim, those are permitted because the person observing the child can assume that whatever was done yesterday, right? So in the case of Rechitza v'Sicha, they'll see the child is clean and they'll assume that he was cleaned yesterday. Masha'en came by Nilata Sandal. Nilata Sandal, I see that he has shoes on, and I know that they weren't put on yesterday because no parent would put shoes on their child yesterday. Then the Gemara says, "Vaha mutarin l'chadchila katan." The whole thing doesn't make sense because the Braita says you're allowed to do these things. What does it mean you're allowed to do them, if not to say that you're allowed to do them today on Yom Kippur? Rashi says, "Hamutarin lechatchila katani shimba li malech." If somebody comes to get advice, omrim lo, we say to him, "He'echiluhu uruchotzoto." If somebody would ask a Rav, somebody asks a posek on Yom Kippur, and you would ask the Rav, am I allowed to wash my child? Am I allowed to feed my child? We would say, mutar lechatchila. Right now, you can feed them and you could wash them. And of course, then he would know, the person that he was being asked will know that this person is doing it on Yom Kippur. But of course, it's still permitted. So this whole idea that I only permit things that look like they could have been done yesterday doesn't make sense. If it's mutar, it means it's mutar l'chatchila. It means that right now I'm allowed to do them. Ella, so then we give this answer, right? Ella, hanach l'lav rebitihu gazru b'hu rabban. So rather, right? So Michael, what does that mean? Hanach l'lav rebitihu gazru b'hu rabban.
Those of the Inuim that are not necessary for the growth of the child, the Rabbanim made a decree on.
Right. And Hanach the Ribitihu lo gazu b'hu rabban. That means
those of the Inuim that are necessary for growth of the child, the Rabbanim didn't issue a decree.
oh, and how do I know that these things are necessary for the growth of the child? Because Abaye said that my mother told me that Ribite, the Yenuka, the upbringing of the child, Maya Chamime Mashcha. And Rashi says, Maya Chamimi, hot water, the Rechitza for washing, Umashcha Lasuch, right? Mashcha is oil for anointing. Gadal Purta, Biata Bekutacha. He gets a little older. You give him an egg with his kutach. Rashi says beitzim bekutach, right? The ayin is mitchalefet with the tzadi in a lot of Aramaic words, like ara, right? Is eretz, right? Eretz in Aramaic is ara with an ayin, and beitzah is biat be'ah. So, okay. Gadal Purta, he gets a little bit older. Tvure Mani. Rashi says, Tvure Mani, he breaks Kelim. What does it mean, Tvure Mani? Lavkir lo Kelim l'shaber u'malot avato. You give him your mafkir, your kelim. You give him kelim, right? That are you, as it were, give up ownership of your kelim for the child to break and to fill his desire. So anybody who has children know that this is a real wisdom. Kids like to take things and bang them. So this is right. Ki hada Rabba, and this is what Rabba did. Zavin lehumanik zize de pachro lepnei. He would buy manik zize de pachro. Rashi says, kelim stukim shel cheres, v'damim kalim. Rashi adds with at, at a low price, right? Literally, right, at a light value. He would buy cheap, cracked pottery to give to his child to break. Okay, so very good. So we got through this part. Let's take a moment and let's see this in the Shulchan Aruch. Haktani matay yatchil lihitanot. So this is in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tafresh Tetzayin. When do children start to lihit anot, right? To do the inuyim on Yom Kippur. So it says that tinokot mutarim b'chol elus. Right, this is coming after the Shulchan Aruch has already given us the other. It's listed the inuyim, and now it says tinokot are permitted in all of these. Chutz mi b'nilata sandal. Except for nilata sandal, shein chosheshin kol kach im lo yinalu, because we're not so worried if they don't put on shoes. Hagav, Rama says, mutar lomar l'nachri l'rachtzanu l'sochan, aval l'ha'achila mafil biyadayim shari. Rama says you're allowed to tell a non-Jew to wash them or anoint them, but to feed them, you're allowed to do that with your own hands. You're allowed to do it directly. Okay. So this wording of the Shulchan Aruch is interesting, right? How did he come up with this wording? 1 second. Where did I put that? Here. Let's look for a moment at the Rambam. So we saw this Rambam last time. We saw the beginning of it. You're not allowed to put on a shoe or a sandal even on one foot. And let's say the sandal shel sham. You're allowed to go out with our famous sandal shel sham. V'shel gemi yotzei behen v'korech adam beged al raglav yotzei bo. Sharei koshi aretz magil raglav. Right, we talked about this last time. Margishu yachef. Right, so an adult is allowed to put these things on Yom Kippur because he can feel the hardness of the ground. Then he says, "Hatinokot af al pishen mutarim ba'achila u'v'shtiya u'rechitza v'sicha." Even though tinokot are allowed to eat, to drink, and to wash and to anoint, monin otan minin al v'sandal. We prevent them from having a shoe or a sandal. And he doesn't say why, as is his way. Just a second. But let's see what the what does the Magid Mishnah say? Hatinokot afu pi shehin mutarin v'chule. Magid Mishnah was one of the early Nosei Kelim, right? One of the people who wrote on the Rambam mainly to bring the Rambam's sources. Right? He was one of the early people to bring sources for the Rambam, as that was one of the one of the major objections to the Mishnah Torah when it was first published, even in the life of the Rambam, is people objected to the fact that he didn't bring his sources. I think we've talked about this in the past. And so what does he say about this? Atinokot, afal pishen mutar l'chulei sham, dafayin chetam lebetz. It's the sugya we just saw. Tanuna banan tinokot mutarin b'chulan chutz mimin al v'sandal. V'sham mevuar shetam mimnei sheshar dvarim kishisachinoto rochatzinoto Rabba umitgadel. These other things, when you wash the child or you put oil on the child, then they flourish and they get bigger. Avabinilata sandal asurim. They're forbidden to put on sandalim. The kevan dein lahem begidulan ein behen gidulin gazru behen chachamim. It doesn't contribute to their growing properly to have shoes. So in that, Chachamim were gozer. So that's what we saw from the Gemara, and this is the derech of Rashi. This is how Rashi understood that issue. Let's take a second before we look further at the Shulchan Aruch. Let's look at the tour. Did I lose him? Here we go. Let's see how the tour words this. The tour says, "Hatinokot mutarin b'chol elu chutz mi b'nilat sandal she'en chosheshin kol kach im lo yina'alu." Right. So we see this is where the Shulchan Aruch gets his language. We're not so worried if they don't put shoes on. So about bishar dvarim shehem mitzta'arim ein lemonan mehem. Other things where they will be mitzta'er, they're going to they'll suffer, they'll feel bad if they don't do them, then we don't hold back from them. So it's an interesting wording from the Torah. What do you think he means when he says, on the one hand, he says, we don't let them put on shoes because we're not so worried if they don't put on shoes. But other things, they'll be mitzta'er, that they will be mitzta'er, we don't hold back from them. So how does he understand this idea of wearing shoes or not wearing shoes for the child?
Maybe that they probably often don't wear shoes. It's something that they're just used to anyway. It's not clear to me.
Yeah, it could be. In other words, if you let the child go, it's not going to hurt him. The Torah doesn't seem like he's directly quoting from the Gemara, right? So the Gemara says those things which you need for the upbringing of the child, Chachamim weren't gozer. The nilata sandal you don't need for upbringing of the child. So it could be that this is how the Torah understands that. What does it mean? You don't need it for the upbringing of the child. It just means that the kid won't suffer if you let him go without shoes for the day. Yeah, I see, Paul, you're shaking your head, but of course, we're used to wearing shoes. There was, not everybody had shoes all the time, right? Depending on where you were in the world. Having shoes was something that you didn't necessarily have. People did go barefoot. It wasn't ideal. We have the other things from the Gemara about it. So in the morning, we say the bracha of Sha'asali Kol Tzarki, right? This is one of the ones that we say. That's in the Gemara that brings down the bracha. It says that you say that when you put on your shoes. Those are the Birkot HaShachar are Birkot HaDa'ah, right? They're brachot of thanks. So why is it that you say a bracha of Shasali Kol Tzarki when you put on your shoes? The implication is that with putting on my shoes, now you've given me everything I need. If I didn't have shoes, I would be a little short. I would be short of everything that I need. But, I could still survive, right? And Dafka Yom Kippur, right? We're poskim who, Tzmachokas poskim about whether you say Shasali Kol Tzarki in the morning with the regular Birkot HaShachar. Some people don't say it because they don't put on shoes. You don't put shoes on Yom Kippur. And on Motzei Yom Kippur, when they put their shoes on, that's when they say Shasali Kol Tzarki. Anyway, on the one hand, you could but the emphasis on that would be Kol Tzarki, all of my needs. It implies that if you don't have shoes, you don't have all of your needs. You have, let's say, most of your needs, but you don't necessarily have all of your needs. But not putting on shoes just means, okay, so you're missing one of your needs. You're missing, let's say, your final need, but you could live without it, as we know, right? Adults go without it. Children could also go without it. It's just interesting that the Torah doesn't directly quote the Gemara the way we have it, but he says the other side. He adds in the other side, "Bishar dvarim shemitztarim ein lemonan mehen." The other thing for which they will be mitztaer if they don't have, we don't hold back from them. You're allowed to, in other words, therefore, you're allowed to feed them with your own hands. You're allowed to feed them directly. Okay, you know what? I'll skip the Beis Yosef. Let's go back for a minute to the Shulchan Aruch, and let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Tarim b'chol elu. What does the Mishnah Berurah say? Berechitza v'sicha v'achila shtiya. Right, all the other inuyim. Shelo gazru al ktanim. They weren't gozer on the ktanim. Mutar legadol ha'achila nashkato lesocho rachzo. And it means, right, so here you see the way the Mishnah Berurah phrases this, that the child is permitted in all of these inuyim, and then he clarifies, it means that the adult can do all of these things for the child. And then he says, "V'dafka rechitza b'tzonein." You can only wash the child with cold water. V'lo yechitzena b'chamin, kol gufo. You shouldn't wash him the whole body with hot water. Even if you warm the water up from the day before. You're not allowed, that's not something that's particular to Yom Kippur, but that's something that you're not allowed to do on any Shabbat, to wash the whole body with hot water. It's a separate issue, right? So it's also a sort for adults to wash your whole body with hot water on Shabbat. Chutz min yata sandal, right? He's permitted in all of them except for putting on shoes. We're not choshesh kolkach. So no lamar shein ze inui katanim lo yinu. And the Mishnah Berurah says it just means plainly, the implication is it's not such a suffering for the child, it's not such an affliction for the child if he doesn't put shoes on. So now he brings back this idea from the Gemara. This excludes lafuke, it excludes though eating, drinking, and washing and anointing, that they are helpful for the growth of the child. Shekain hayah minhag bizmanam. That was the minhag in their time. That all four of these things, not just eating and drinking, but also washing and anointing. Nima katan noel me'atzmo. And if the child puts their shoes on by themselves, do you have to protest? That we explain elsewhere. That's in Hilchot Shabbat, in Siman Shin Mem Gimel. And you're allowed to tell a. So what we saw in the tour, right? That you're allowed to wash them. And the Shulchan Aruch says that you're allowed to. The Ramah says you're allowed to say. This is from the tour that was left out by the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah says you're allowed to tell directly a non-Jew to wash them and to anoint them, but you're allowed to feed them directly. So the Mishnah Berurah says, the chidush here is that you're allowed to tell the non-Jew, and this is amira legoy, meaning you're allowed to tell them directly, not in this kind of roundabout way. You can tell a non-Jew on Yom Kippur to wash your child with water, even water that was warmed up on Yom Kippur. Why? Stam tinok is we consider him to be like a sick person regarding hot water, meaning that because the child is considered to be like a sick person, and that part of the refuah is going to be that needs to be washed in hot water, then the same way that you could say to a non-Jew on Shabbat to warm up hot water for a sick person, you can say to the non-Jew to warm up hot water and wash the child on Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to. I spoke to some. You're not allowed to tell the non-Jew directly to warm them up. Achronim say nowadays we're not accustomed to washing and anointing the child every day. And not washing them or anointing them for the day isn't considered to be an inui. You shouldn't wash them or anoint them, even by way of a non-Jew, because this is what we do nowadays. This is how we do it nowadays. Unlike so it's interesting, right? So because from the Gemara, the implication is it's actually necessary because Amra liyem, this is what my mother said. And the implication is that my mother said you have to do this for the child every day. But Achronim say, okay, but we don't do that every day anyway, so we don't have to do it on Yom Kippur. You know what? I think I'll leave this. Maybe we'll look at the Aruch HaShulchan next time, but then we'll continue on in the sugya. But I think that's it for today. Yeah. Any last questions, comments? Okay. So Bezrat Hashem, we'll meet again next week at 7:30 Israel time, which is going to be
an hour earlier for us.
An hour earlier for those of us who are not in Israel.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thanks.